Nigeria is on a path to a planned presidential handover in a matter of days. But to a lot of people across the country, that path appears strewn with complications, principally emanating from the Presidential Election Tribunal, where substantive cases against Mr. Tinubu's declaration as winner by the Independent National Electoral Commission are pending, but materially speaking, not making much progress. Tempers are flaring among a sizable chunk of the polity who are convinced that Tinubu's victory failed to meet critical constitutional requirements, including a compulsory scoring of at least 25% of all votes cast in Abuja, the Federal Capital Territory. For a conversation around the ongoing litigations against Tinubu, the general mood of the nation, and the diaspora Nigerians' viewpoint about political developments at home, we're now being joined by Professor Chika Mordi of Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, Maryland, and Chairman United Capital PLC. Good to have you on Newsday. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
Well, first of all, let me just have your own assessment, of everything that happened with the presidential election and the fact that there will be an inauguration even before election petitions, have been resolved. It's not new. We've been doing it over the years, but I would just like to know, what you make of this, of the whole election process.
There's the good, there's the bad, and there's the ugly, to use a cliche. There are elements of the election that were good. There was a high level of engagement by demographic segments that typically don't engage as much in the build-up to the election. There's a lot of excitement around it, and the apathy we tend to associate with elections wasn't there. And there's a genuine belief that this election would reflect the will of the people. So going in, there were positives around that, and that's what democracy is about. Now, in terms of the of litigation, like you rightly said, every election except the 2015 election, every election in this current dispensation, that's 1999 to date, has been litigated in court. Some of them were in court up to a few months before the end of the term of the president. So it's become tradition. Now, fortunately, the law sort of has a time limit on how long it can be in court for. Is it desirable? No. There's an element of uncertainty that it creates. So in an ideal world, it would be better to have clarity. But then again, you look at the United States, and till this day, the former president insists that the election was rigged, and some of his followers still believe that he will become president even before the end of President Biden's term. So it's not totally anomalous. It happens, but it's politics.
Now, talking about the United States, the United States, international election observers, they condemned, the outcome of the 2023 election. We've seen quite a number of Western countries, including the United States, saying that the election was not actually free and fair. But at the same time, we've also seen these Western countries, including the United States, express a readiness to work with the incoming administration. How do we make sense of this, especially considering the fact that they're also sanctioning some Nigerians for allegedly misbehaving during the elections? In one breath, they're imposing visa ban. In the next breath, they're working with an administration which they say did not come to power, credibly.
It's quite nuanced, and I would, in my opinion, there are two dimensions to it. One, the first dimension is about the outcome of the election. There's a difference between an election might be deemed not free and fair and could be very imperfect, but at the same time, it does not mean that the outcome could be different. What I mean by that is it's a different story if there's a clear outcome and a clear winner and it was perverted and there's sufficient evidence to prove that, as against where the process was very flawed, or perhaps the winner was the person who was going to win either way. And I'm not trying to make a judgment on this election. I'm just trying to say, hypothetically, that they're two different things. They could both be correct. The second thing you must remember is, in the end, it's about national interest. So if it's in the U.S. interest to pursue a certain line, and if they make the judgment that it will be the best interest of even Nigeria, right, by working with whatever government is in power at the end of the day, I think it's fair to protect interests and say whoever ends up in government will work with them, unless it's very clear that the larger interest, not only of the US, but even of Nigeria, they make the judgment, would not be better, then they could take that position.
Now, while we are waiting the outcome of, the litigations, the president-elect has been reaching out to the opposition. People are speculating that he's probably trying to form a unity government. Is this a step in the right direction, considering how past presidential election disputes have been resolved in Nigeria?
I think if indeed he's doing that, because some of the reports, I remember they went out of their way to refute a report of a unity government. But I feel that to have a conducive environment to govern, it's important to bring in the opposition to try to calm some frayed nerves and to get some sort of buy-in of the populace, just to get the necessary to douse tensions and have the space to govern. And if that is the case, it's a good idea. It's better, obvious, than being adversarial and having friction.
I'd like to talk about how Nigerians in diaspora, especially in the US where you're based, how do they feel about all what's happening in Nigeria? Are they optimistic that, the judiciary is up to the task? And if the president-elect's victory is confirmed, not that we are speculating, but I'm just saying if, do you think he can perform better maybe than the current administration?
Well, let me unpack that. There are two questions there. The first one, I think it was sort of anticlimactic for many people. This is anecdotal. I've not done a study of tried to do a poll. But from the little interaction, there was a lot of expectation and a lot of optimism about where the election would go. And no surprise as to there was some maybe a preferred candidate who didn't quite emerge. So there was some sort of disappointment, some anticlimax. And also, the process was also, quite frankly, in some locations, disappointing what was seen on social media. Having said that, there's some sense of resignation. So that this is going to be, and so what do we do going forward? Okay, it's happened, what next? And I think if you think of Mexico in the 80s, when you had a ruling party that had been in power for over 2 years, and there was some opposition that got together against them and appeared to be doing well. And when the results were announced halfway after that, the results changed, and it took another electoral cycle to get that, but it got the engagement and it made governance even better. So I would say, in a sense, people recognize that, okay, this might be the case, but this does not mean that they would necessarily oppose, should that be the government that emerges. And the second half of your question was...
If his victory is confirmed, if you think probably, he can do better than what we have now.
To be honest, and I'd say this in a very, with all objectivity, it's a very low bar. By any objective metric, the performance of the last government in terms of the economy, in terms of security, in terms of every aspect of social welfare has been abysmal. And so it's a low base to start from. And I think it will be, to the contrary, I think it will be very difficult to do worse than the outgoing government, with all respect.
Well, talking about the assessment, of this current administration, the outgoing administration, the president believes he has laid a solid foundation for a prosperous Nigeria. What are your thoughts? Do you agree? If you say that his performance has been poor, do you agree that he has laid a foundation, for somebody else to build on and probably give us the results we desire?
It will be very difficult to agree with that position. I don't see any evidence that supports a stronger foundation for growth. And it would be nice to know the specifics about what is stronger. If it's about increased productivity in the country, we can't see the evidence of that. If it's about improved human capital or improved inputs that are necessary for better productivity or for growth, we can't see that. On the contrary, we can see that what has been bequeathed in terms of the fiscal situation and the security situation, many other situations, actually are retardants for growth. So the issue is, we could argue about the context in which all of this happened, but the reality on ground today is a foundation has not been bequeathed for good, from my perspective, that is.
Now, talking about preparations towards May 29th, when we'll have the handover ceremony, Security forces have been talking tough, warning certain groups against destabilizing the nation or trying to scuttle the swearing-in ceremony. But I'd like you to assess the performance of our security forces so far during this election cycle, and what advice do you have for them regarding future elections?
Okay, I can't pretend to be a security expert, but I think it's not rocket science, especially with technologies that's at the disposal of people and the security agents, trying to protect the vote and protect people who are voting and electoral officials is not such a complex exercise. And the learning point is that perhaps they should engage less with the politicians and actually protect the electoral officials and the voters.
Now, another controversy making the rounds is about choosing the leadership of the 10th National Assembly. I'm sure you're aware of that. The APC has zoned positions, it's handpicking candidates. I'd like to know what you make of this. How would you advise lawmakers elect to maintain their independence despite this interference?
I believe that the checks, the structure of democracy, our democracy in Nigeria at least, by design, the legislature should serve as some sort of check on the executive, and judiciary as well plays a role, obviously, all three of them. And if they end up being cronies or people who are subservient to the executive, it doesn't all go well, even for the executives in terms of meeting the agenda. Right, so it's very important that there are people who are independent enough and not to become adversaries, but at least work in a way where they could carry the oversight functions and they can serve as a good check. So you look at some of the borrowing that is, quite frankly, unconstitutional, the kind of borrowing that, if we call it borrowing, where the central bank has been providing short-term funds beyond the limits they should have for the government, and it grew to such sums. Now, fortunately, it's being restructured. That would not have happened if there was good oversight in the National Assembly. They would have been called early enough to limit the amount of that borrowing and force some fiscal discipline around public finance.
And still on our lawmakers elect, what sort of bills would you like to see them pass, especially as regards strengthening our electoral laws?
You know, I don't want to sound cynical. So I'm not sure the problem is so much with the laws that are on the books, but as to how they're implemented. So if INEC makes commitments and there are legal requirements on how they want to upload or count votes, and they're not complying with that, then what good is the law if you're not going to enforce it? So maybe a starting point is to enforce the laws that are on the books and then tweak the ones that, there's some elements like we talked about the protracted nature of litigation after swearing in and the rest of it. They could tweak laws to try to get that done before May 29. They could space out elections. There are a few things that the laws could make better, but the starting point is enforcing them. If they're not properly enforced, then it doesn't matter how beautiful they are as laws.
Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, diaspora voting.
Yeah.
Is Nigeria really ready for diaspora voting when we're still struggling, to even conduct free and fair national election?
Well, absolutely we're ready. And why do I say that? In the past few years, we've introduced the NIN, we introduced BVN, and most Nigerian diasporans got BVN, got NIN, they're able to do those things. And if you're going to vote in America, there are such facilities and agencies that can make the voting seamless, easy, and very credible. Even if it means speaking locations that, including even the embassy locations, there are 3-4 locations in the country, it's easy for them to achieve that. It will probably be a more credible and transparent process than the one that happens within the country.
Well, we've talked about what's happening in Nigeria, but I would just like to have a little information about you. We know you're a professor at the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, and you're also the chairman of United Capital. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
I'm not very good about talking about myself, but I think United Capital is, you probably know, and I hope you have some sort of banking relationship with us. If you don't, then you should. We're the only quoted investment banking outfit in the country. We've had consistent double-digit growth for the last decade. Even during COVID, there is a full-service investment bank, and I've very resoundingly recommend United Banking Group to members of the public. In terms of me as an individual, I'm Nigerian more than anything else, and I'm proudly so, and committed to seeing a better country. And that day is going to come. There's a saying that in the darkest night, dawn still emerges. Nigeria's dawn is going to emerge.
Well, I'm going to tap into your financial sense, and just bring you back to what's happening in Nigeria. This current administration has blamed the high inflation in the country on the COVID-19 pandemic, saying that no nation is immune to high inflation rate following the COVID lockdowns. According to the presidential spokesperson, Garba Shehu, this administration has consistently prioritized efforts to control inflation and will continue to do so. I saw the way you reacted when I said that. What do you make of this?
With all respect, those apply.
I mean, bearing in mind, indeed, that so many countries all over the world, including the UK, I think even the US, they're experiencing high inflation. So I'd like you to react to it objectively as much as possible.
Some would say they sound like platitudes. The reality is, if you look at Nigeria's inflation, the evidence just doesn't support it. Empirical evidence is that it was already double digits before COVID. And yes, when COVID hit, you had a spike, but it stayed up and even gone higher. Now, the Nigerian economy is structurally different from the other economies because it's actually the reverse. Yes, COVID did create supply chain bottlenecks and economic contraction. But since then, you've had, for more than a year of the war in Ukraine, you've had very high oil prices, which should increase foreign exchange earnings, government revenue, and therefore even strengthen the economy and help sort of curtail some of the macroeconomic variables that are going very south. So I don't think, for me, it's not a plausible reason for that.
I'd also like you to talk about the regional politics that has been played so far. I'm sure you know that during the elections, there were a lot of hateful, divisive rhetoric, inflammatory rhetoric. And even though it's sort of died down, people are still worried that it's still simmering underneath. We've never been so much divided along religious line, ethnic lines. Can you talk about it? What do you think is causing it, and how can it be curbed?
It's troubling. It's normal that politicians will try to use identity politics. So whatever it is in the country, it could be color, it could be race, it could be religion, but it's identity politics. And they prey on that and use that to get votes by trying to, demonize the other meaning someone who is not from that group. In our case, it was sad to see that we reverted to tribal lines, but it's not unusual. The point I'm making is it happens in many other countries. It's happened in this country in the past, but maybe this time around, it happened in metropolis areas where they were not used to seeing that sort of thing happen. And I hope it's very hard when the genie is out of the bottle to put it back in. But I hope as the election gets more remote, as in we move further from the election, that all of that emotion would sort of simmer and people could get back to. This is a hope more than anything else. They could get back to. And the way to do that, I suspect, is it's part of the work for the incoming administration. The way to do that is to, sort of emphasize the reasons why we are Nigerians and point out that we have far more in common than we have that drives us apart.
Professor Chika Mordi from Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, Maryland, and Chairman United Capital, thank you so much for joining us on News.
Thank you.